So one thing to keep in mind is like, how do you know when you need to go see a therapist? Everybody may not need that. And one of the keys to that is if you have an issue, whether it comes from a past trauma, either childhood trauma or something that's happened later in your life, or if you have mental illness symptoms that have been going on for a long time and more than probably 3 months. But if you've had the same problems and it just something that you just cannot get under control or is just not going away, then that's probably when it's time to go talk to someone because you want to come out of these situations with growth and healing, not just treating symptoms because treating symptoms is good. I love treating symptoms. I don't like having symptoms of depression. All mental illness is on a spectrum. And that's something that I think people need to understand a little bit better.
Hi, Jamie. Welcome back to Stories and Stanza, and hello everyone for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me again.
Thank you so much for taking the time. It was a really interesting discussion that we had. And for our listeners who are watching this for the first time, I would request them to go back and watch the part one of our podcast so that you will get a little bit more context as to what we covered in that and what we intend to discuss today. So, just doing a little bit of recap as to where we left off our discussion. And we talked about different mental health struggles. We talked a fair bit about journaling. We touched upon ADHD. We touched upon trauma. And towards the end, we talked about the goal orientation in therapy. And
Yes.
that is a subject that I think it demands a discussion on its own, which is why we are back together creating this episode. So,
Absolutely.
Jamie, my personal take is that, and this is not just me, I've heard it from people around me, is that we are going into therapy, but we don't know what we are getting out of it or where we
Mm-hmm.
are going. So the path is
Mm-hmm.
often not clear for anyone going into therapy. So this is
Mm-hmm.
something I wanted to explore with you based on your field of work, your professional experience and everything that and something that could help people is to understand what do we want out of therapy, how do we
Mm-hmm.
articulate that, and especially if we are coming from vulnerability, then it's often not clear what we want. So how
Mm-hmm.
do we take the first step and how do we set a roadmap for our journey?
Okay, yeah, it's a great conversation, and I think it's extremely important because it's like many other things in life. If you haven't done it already, you don't really know what to expect. And we see TV shows and movies and things where people are going to see therapists, and we have this old school sense of you go in, you lay on the couch, and you tell the therapist all about your father, and that's funny coming from entertainment industry, but it's not really like that, or it shouldn't be like that, anyways. So one thing to keep in mind is like, how do you know when you need to go see a therapist? Everybody may not need that. And one of the keys to that is if you have an issue, whether it comes from a past trauma, either childhood trauma or something that's happened later in your life, or if you have mental illness symptoms that have been going on for a long time, and more than probably 3 months. So if you have some symptoms that go on for about 3 months and then they start fading away and going away, and this is not something you've dealt with your entire life, you probably don't need a therapist. Whatever's going on, you are starting to work out on your own, whatever that is. But if you've had the same problems and it just something that you just cannot get under control or is just not going away, then that's probably when it's time to go talk to someone. So I guess one of the first steps then is, who do you go talk to? So just like other fields of medicine, different therapists have different specialties sometimes. Most licensed therapists are educated and trained and experienced in your in what we would call talk therapy. This is the basics. This is, you go in, they ask you what's going on, and you tell them, and then they go from there. So you could have a psychologist. So a psychologist is anyone that is studying or working in the field of psychology. Doesn't necessarily mean therapy. It could be research. It could be writing. It could be a clinical practice they're studying for their PhD, that kind of thing. So you want to look for someone that is specifically a licensed therapist if you're going to go see someone. Another, I guess, distinction would be psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. So let's say you have schizophrenia. So you have a more severe mental health condition. So you're probably going to go to a psychiatrist at some point because they know which medications are going to treat more severe symptoms. And they can prescribe medicine and make referrals for any mental health condition. But like if, let's say, grief was the problem that you're having, you had a loss in your life, a loved one, a family member, a spouse, a child, something like that, and it's been a couple of years. And grief is one of those things where it takes its time. There is no treating it with the sense of hurrying the results and getting over it. It's one of those things that kind of sticks with you, but it fades over time. It lessens over time. But if it's not, like I said earlier, if it's something that is just ongoing and it's just causing you depression, it's affecting your daily life, your relationships, your job, your appetite, your health, then that's when, you probably want to go speak to someone. So grief would be something that you could go see a licensed therapist. So that's kind of ways to know if it's the right time. And when you look at a therapist, it's okay to shop around, as we say. It's okay to make a few phone calls or get online and make an appointment for what we would call an initial consultation. So during an initial consultation, you're speaking with the therapist just to find out if it's going to be a good match. You're not really that first conversation is not about what happened to you 2 years ago, what happened to you during childhood, what are your depression symptoms, what are your anxiety symptoms, those things. You're talking with them and saying, okay, what kind of services do you provide? So let's say, for instance, you're living in another country, but you're living in a country that this is your second language. So, but you want to talk to a therapist, it's better to find someone that speaks your native language because you're going to have a better understanding of not just the words, but the meanings behind the words, those kind of things. Like I speak some Spanish, but I'm not fluent by any means. So I could understand the word for sadness, triste, but if someone was telling me about a deep depression and they've had all these feelings since childhood, I'll probably get lost after like the second sentence. So I want to see a therapist, but I'm in another country. So I can go online and find therapy programs. Well, obviously, the first question is going to be, is this virtual? Does this person only provide in service or do they provide virtual services? So things like that. You want to, it sounds boring. It sounds mundane, but you want to ask those logistics questions first and get that out of the way. Hey, what's your specialty? Okay. Oh, you have a specialty with trauma? Great. That's what I got. I got trauma. I want you. Another one that I found and this took a lot of experience, I learned this through experience myself going through therapy. And because I went through the same thing when I first started, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what to ask or what to say, any of that. I just had to learn through experience. But for me, I learned that if I'm talking with someone about seeing them, I want to ask, what is their personality type or what is their style? And there's generally two types. There's very direct or very comforting. And this is where you kind of have to know yourself, but be very honest. Don't just go in thinking, oh, this is a therapist. I need someone extremely compassionate, extremely caring, and comforting. Maybe not, because you got to think back to what do you respond best to in life? If you have a best friend and you go to them with a problem, do you respond better when they say, oh, you have that problem because you screwed up. You need to go right now and fix it. Yeah, here's what you need to do. You need to form an apology. You need to rectify this situation. Yeah, you screwed up. I love you. I'm going to help you, but you screwed up. Let's go fix this. That's very direct. Or do you gravitate towards a friend that's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Tell me all about that. Oh, here, let me give you a hug. Let's just sit and have coffee and talk about this. Or, yeah, let's meet for a drink and just tell me all about it. You see what I'm saying? You have to be honest with yourself and know what you respond to best. That's what you want to find in your therapist. Because the reason I found this out through my experience is because my childhood trauma, a big portion of it came from my relationship with my father. He was very verbally, emotionally, psychologically abusive. So when I started going to therapy, I would go, if I went into a therapist and they were very direct, I was done. I shut down immediately because it brought back the abuse. It brought back the verbal abuse. And I couldn't do it. I was like, I can't do this. I can't. No. So I missed out on a lot of opportunities early because I didn't know what questions to ask. I didn't know what to look for. I needed someone more comforting and compassionate to bring out the past, and I didn't feel attacked. Now, later, years later, after I've done a lot of healing, a lot of work, I've been to therapy, et cetera, now if I were to go talk to a therapist and they were super soft and compassionate and squishy and lovey, done. I don't want to hear that. I'm at the point now to where I want direct. I want someone to say, oh, did you just say this word or did you just bring back this memory? You're not healed from that. That's what we want to talk about. So your needs can change, but if it's your first time, definitely ask those questions.
Thank you for explaining that. And I just want to say to our listeners as well that in our discussion, we are trying to create right set of informations so that it helps people to
Mm,
understand what help they need and what information they should have. And that's very interesting. And thank you for sharing that. I'll just go back to something you mentioned, again, I'm coming from my personal experience, so I'm definitely not generalizing. I'm just is- sharing some facts out here. So when
mm,
we have psychological problem that's troubling us, then we are approaching a therapist. Or sometimes the problem can be more severe, where the talk therapy wouldn't help, and then we will need to go to a psychiatrist. Right? So you talked about that, and that's where I think here in Australia, so usually the doctors do an assessment, like they have some questionnaire and the sets that decides whether you go see a psychologist or not. Then, but there, I do not know if there is an assessment that tells, okay, this is not something that's going to be resolved in therapy, which is where you need to go to a psychiatrist. Like, is it possible to somewhat assess this? May not be accurately, but just to understand whether we need to go to a therapist or we need to go to a psychiatrist. Okay. I am telling this because I will share my personal experience here as well, that my wife was going through a very severe phase of depression and paranoia. And to me, it was, of course, not normal. I was trying to say that your fears are not real, your fears are not accurate, and things like that. It didn't help. And therapy also didn't help for quite some time. But I didn't know what was going on in the therapy because she was the patient, not both of us. So I was not sure what she was going through and what was revealed and things like that. And I was clueless for quite some time as to what is going on, because the therapist, because of this confidentiality, couldn't share anything with me. She could only share with the patient, and I was not the patient. So I was just going back and forth for a while. And then the therapist came up with a genius idea. She said that go to your doctor and say that you are not going through a good phase because you are supporting. So then you come back to me as a patient, and then we'll see what we can do. And then we discussed, and we were able to circumvent that confidentiality. And then she said, okay, this is what my assessment is, this is a referral, now you can go see a psychiatrist. So it took a long time to understand whether I should go to a therapist or should go to a psychiatrist. I am trying to understand, and again, this can be helpful for anyone. Is it possible to know at our level that we need talk therapy or we need to see a psychiatrist, a medical doctor?
good question. Yeah, so on the medical side, one good thing is that your primary care physician, your general doctor, also can prescribe medication for like depression, things like that. Now they also have the ability to make a referral to a psychiatrist if it's something that they're not comfortable. They probably know about it, but it's not their specialty. So they'll be like, yeah, okay, well, let's get you to this doctor. And they're a psychiatrist and they can make a better diagnosis or, you know, the best prescription that will work for you. But your doctor can also make referrals to a therapist, a talk therapist. So you can see them and say, hey, I'm struggling with this depression. I've had it for 3 or 4 years now. I also have this symptom, this symptom. It's always best, whether you're starting on the therapy side or the medical side, to be very open and honest about your symptoms. Again, you don't have to start off with all of the background stuff, but if you can literally just write down what you're experiencing symptom wise, that gives them a clear picture and helps them know which direction you need to go, how they can help best. In most cases, it's likely that a combination of medicine and therapy will be the best treatment. If you start off on medication and you're going to therapy, it might be that you're not on that medication forever. You might just need it for a certain amount of time to help manage symptoms as you work through other issues. It might be that you start on one medication and end up going to lower dosage over time. Always think of it in the long term. And I know that's difficult for when you're like right in the middle of trauma or stress or some of the other symptoms. It's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's there. And so try your best to think of it in long terms. Like, okay, I'm going to the doctor tomorrow, but even if I get on medication, I'm not just going to take this and in 2 weeks everything's going to be okay and be better and my life is completely changed. It won't be, and it shouldn't be, because you want to come out of these situations with growth and healing, not just treating symptoms, because treating symptoms is good. I love treating symptoms. I don't like having symptoms of depression. And so it's nice to not have those. But at the same time, this is my life I'm talking about and what I want to enjoy and experience in life. And I don't want to constantly have to deal with all of these issues. When you knowing whether you're going to need one or both, you, again, it's one of those things. If you haven't been through it, you probably don't know, and that's fine. It wouldn't be expected of anything else. If you're having symptoms of high blood pressure, let's say you're walking up a hill and you don't even make it halfway up the hill and you're already out of breath. Your heart's beating out of your chest. Your pulse is rising. You every time you eat salt, you swell up, your joints ache, things like that. You're having some of these symptoms. You don't automatically just know the the cause or the treatment. That's why you go to the doctor and that's why you tell them about the symptoms. Same thing with mental health, anxiety, depression, grief, paranoia, those things. You don't have to know any of that stuff. You're not there yet. You'll get there, but you don't have to know. You don't have to feel bad that you don't know these things yet. Just go and get started. Just take that first step. And you can go to either one. You can go to a therapist or you can go to your doctor. And the therapist, like I said, with the doctor, will also be able to say, oh, you're having these symptoms and these issues. I think you need to go see a doctor because they can probably prescribe you this type of medication that treats those type of symptoms. So your therapist can't prescribe your medicine, but they can definitely refer you to a doctor, and they can even send something in writing with your permission and say, here, I saw this patient, they're having these symptoms. And that's all they're going to put. They're not going to divulge any personal information, but uh, either place you get started, medically or therapeutically, you can get help for both issues.
Thank you so much for explaining that so well. And it has been my sincere effort in this podcast that we bring in the authentic stories and experiences that can help people. They will, of course, need to work on their own healing path, but sometimes these little pointers that can make a big difference when it comes to mental health. And you mentioned something that when you go to a therapist could be sometimes very direct, or they can be more soothing and comforting. And someone going through a problem, they will react differently to both sort of conditions. Is it possible to do a self check that the therapy is working for me in that particular style or narrative, or the treatment that we are following, or it needs to pivot?
So a couple of things that I would recommend. One is after, I would say, maybe 3 visits. And I know this is very general and people have issues that vary in severity. All mental health is on a spectrum. You hear a lot about autism being a spectrum disorder. In other words, you may have a few symptoms or a lot of symptoms, or you may have 1 or 2 symptoms that are very severe and others that are very mild. So that's on a spectrum. All mental illness is on a spectrum. And that's something that I think people need to understand a little bit better. So you may have anxiety, but maybe it only comes out when you're in public. So that may be more of a form of social anxiety disorder. So all these are on a spectrum. So thinking about that, I say 3 visits is very general. I understand that. But if you've been for three visits to a therapist and you don't feel like you haven't passed the surface. In other words, what you came in the door talking about, you're still talking about it in the same way, you're still just getting things off your chest, so to speak. You should be, the therapist should be moving you along by the third or fourth visit. So the first couple of visits, obviously, they don't know you. They don't know, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you've experienced. So they're trying to learn that. They're trying to understand your journey. They're trying to understand your symptoms, what you're dealing with, what's important to you. And they're trying to understand what's the most important thing for you to work on. So, but at some point, they should have a plan in place and should tell you this. Hey, okay, so right now, here's what we're working on. Here's what we're going to work on. Is this good for you? Does this sound good for you? And it should be a joint effort. It should not just be you coming in and you do all the talking. They just sit there and listen and the Freudian on the couch stuff. That's not correct. That's not good therapy. It shouldn't be you sitting there and them just dictating to you the entire time. Here's what you're going to do. Here's what you need to do. Here's what happened and here's what's going to happen. It should be a joint effort. So, like I said, after about the third visit, you should start seeing them put a plan in place. Now, that plan might be, hey, look, you have some very deep unresolved trauma from your childhood that lasted for your entire childhood, 10, 15 years. So that's going to be a lot to unpack. But here's what we're going to start with. Or here's what I see that might help you the most right now. Do you agree? Again, even if it's a plan to keep discussing and keep unpacking stuff, there should be a plan. There should be something to say, We're going to move forward now. Another thing to know if it's working is if, especially if you're on medication also, psychotropic medication, and a doctor should tell you this, and definitely listen to your doctor's advice. I'm not a medical doctor, so this is coming a lot from my personal experience taking medication for depression. Generally, it takes 2 to 4 weeks before you know if it's working. So it's not like you have a headache and you take some acetaminophen and within 30 minutes it starts going away. These medications generally take a few weeks before you know if they're working. Couple that with therapy. If you're on medication and you're going to therapy, after a few visits, you should start feeling, I hate to say feeling better because I don't necessarily mean it in those words, but your discussions with the therapist should not feel as severe. So like if you're coming in right off the bat and you're talking about this problem you have, you might be crying, you might be anxious, you might be just thinking, your mind might be racing, but after 2 or 3 visits, that should be a little bit less. It should be a little bit less. So that's one way, another way I should say, to know that if it's working. And I would say the third way, which kind of goes back to if the therapist is moving forward in the process and is putting a plan into place, goes hand in hand with that. But on a separate note, they should be at this point giving you some tools, some practical tools for you to do some things on your own. It shouldn't just, if you've been there for 3 visits or 4 visits and they're not helping you to do things for yourself, you're probably not getting the help that you need long term. You may have been in crisis when you first started. So those first 2 or 3 visits, again, may have just been getting everything out, and that could be fine. But after that, there should be like, okay, I hear what you're saying. You're having anxiety, and it seems to be around this issue. Like whenever your mom calls and or texts and says, I want you guys to come over for a family dinner, and you start getting anxious. So there's something there. There's something there about either your mom specifically or going back to the family house, being part of the family. There's something there that's bothering you. So I would like you to start writing that down. The next time you're invited over by your mom, or the next time she messages you or calls you or comes by or whatever, and you start feeling anxious, I just want you to get a pen and pad out, a notebook, a journal, something, and just write anything that comes to mind. Just set a timer for 5 minutes and you just write everything and anything. Don't worry about sentence structure, punctuation, grammar. Just write for 5 minutes till that timer goes off. I want you to write whatever comes to your mind. So that is the therapist giving you a tool to start working in this process, for you to start building resiliency, for you to start taking ownership of yourself. It's called autonomy. And every therapist should be honing in on this. So again, that kind of goes hand in hand with having a plan, but could be a little bit different. So they have a plan. You can see some lessening of the severity, and they are giving you practical tools to move this process along in terms of your healing. So those are the 3 things I would say can help if this process is working.
Thank you for those insights. And I really hope that the awareness we are trying to create in this podcast would definitely resonate with people, help people who are going through their difficult situation. And I wanted to go back to something we touched upon a little bit in our first episode, which was around trauma, which is you talked about your own story, and we talked about journaling and everything. And you mentioned something in the discussion. I was just playing it back after we had our first episode that trauma, or in that way, any sort of negative feeling that can physically affect our mind and body. And in Fail With Me series, what I try to explore is how we can come out of failures, as in how we can unlearn the stigma that is holding us back. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on when we are facing a trauma, then how it impacts us physiologically, and then how does that unlearning work? By unlearning, I'm talking about the stigma and the defense mechanism, anything that we build around that trauma. I want to hear your view on that.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up because that's one of of course, it's my specialty is in trauma, but it's one of the mountains that I like to stand on in terms of education uh, for mental health issues, and that is that physical health is mental health. Anxiety, depression, PTSD, ADHD, all of these things, they're not just in your mind. You've heard the saying, oh, it's all in your mind. No, it's not. It is absolutely not all in your mind. It is in your body. When you go through trauma, and this is true for childhood or adulthood, when you go through trauma, your body reacts. We have survival mechanisms. So if you see something scary, your nervous system kicks in immediately and makes you do something. You don't even have to stop and process it. You don't have to think about it. If it's something that frightens you, you immediately do something. It might be fight, flight, or freeze. They, we've heard that a lot before. Most people have. And so that's an automatic response. That's your nervous system. So what happens is you get a stimuli, it has an immediate response, it sends neurotransmitters to release certain hormones in your body. It could be dopamine, it could be cortisol, adrenaline, those type of things. Well, when trauma happens, it can be so severe that your mind, after the fact, can't process it. So you get stuck in this neurological response. Trauma can be repetitive and it literally rewires your brain. So, especially as children, so your brain and your body is developing, and you have all these neural pathways in your brain that are growing, and like by the millions. And so, if you receive a hug from your mother and she's cuddling you, or if your father comes up and pats you on the head and gives you a hug and says, man, I'm proud of you. As a child, that releases dopamine in your body. It releases oxytocin, and which channels neural pathways in one direction. And it's a good direction, so to speak. But if you get the opposite, if you get abuse, if you get neglect, your body says, no, This is not a good feeling. This isn't an oxytocin feeling. This isn't love and acceptance. This is being unsafe. So therefore, we need to ramp up the body's readiness response. We need to ramp up those survival mechanisms, and we need to be prepared because now we don't feel safe. And your neural pathways literally grow in that direction. So you can develop as you become a young man, young woman, adult, your body is literally wired differently. Now, the good thing is that we have neuroplasticity, which means you can change that. It can take time, obviously. You're changing something internally. You're changing the nervous system of your body and your brain, but it can be changed. So, a couple of things to consider then are, since this is not just in your mind, this is actually in your body, we have to shift our mindset about talk therapy and psychotropic medication are tools, and they're useful and they're needed at times, but they're not going to fix the bodily issues. So you need to consider, what is your diet? What is your exercise? These are things that will start healing your body, which will heal your mind. Because again, your body is releasing these chemicals, these hormones, these neurotransmitters. And if your body's out of whack, those neurotransmitters are going to be out of whack, which is going to affect anxiety, which is going to affect depression and these other issues. There's tons of studies right now, tons, that concretely prove the gut brain connection. However, your gut functions, that affects your mental health. Your gut actually produces serotonin. This is something we didn't know 100 years ago. We didn't know how serotonin affected mental health. We didn't know that you needed serotonin at certain times. But in your gut microbiome, there's both good and bad bacteria. Now, there should be more good than bad in order to keep it in check. But let's say the bad outweighs the good, outnumbers the good. It's going to, those bad bacteria are going to release toxins into the bloodstream, and it goes to your nervous system, and it's going to mess up, it's going to screw up the production of serotonin. There's lots of things. I heard this one doctor, oh, and I cannot think of her name. Oh, please forgive me, because she was phenomenal, but she's been doing a lot of work the past couple of decades on this issue. And I heard her speaking the other day, and something that just blew my mind was that she has made a connection between the copper levels in women's bodies and the effect of estrogen. And I was just like, wow, this is just amazing. I was just like geeking out. This was total nerd fantasy for me to hear this stuff. But she said that she studied women's estrogen levels, and if they have too much copper in their body, in their system, it affects their estrogen levels, which in turn affects dopamine production. So basically, too much copper can literally change dopamine, and it triggers the body into producing more adrenaline. So dopamine's a good chemical. It makes you feel good, energized. When you accomplish a task, when you get an award, you get dopamine. You're like, well, yeah, this is great. ADHD, we've talked about that a little bit. And one of the trademarks of ADHD is that there's a decrease in dopamine. There's not enough. It's dysregulated. It doesn't produce at the normal levels. And so people with ADHD will chase things to make a reward to get that dopamine rush, but then it falls back down. So this scientist, this doctor was saying that this copper basically attacks the dopamine that's produced, and it tells the body that there's a dysregulation, so the body kicks in and produces more adrenaline, which if there's no emergency, guess what that adrenaline does? Gives you anxiety. So there's women coming in who have dysregulated estrogen because there's too much copper in the body, which is then producing too much adrenaline, which gives them anxiety. So they're coming in saying, I've got this anxiety. I've got these premenopausal symptoms and it's way too early. I'm only like 29 and I'm having anxiety. I'm having these other issues. I'm having my menstrual cycles off. And so she started doing these checks and guess what? There's a copper deficiency. Well, in this case, there's too much copper. Sorry. To me, that's just interesting, but I think it's an important point for us for anyone to realize is that even if your issue is a mental health issue, it is also a physical issue in your body. So start learning everything you can, start tracking what foods increase mental health symptoms. What is too much? Is it too much sugar? Is it too much caffeine? What foods can heal the gut? Probiotics, a full strength, real yogurt, those kind of things. It's got good probiotics. Those things help heal the good bacteria in your gut and help, therefore, you start bringing your body up to where you want it to be to regulate these transmitters, these hormones in your body that will in turn affect your mental health. So, and exercise, and I could go on for days about this, but people say, oh yeah, well, you just need to get more exercise. And listen, when I was starting mental health treatment, when I was first getting help for my depression, I was like, man, I don't want to hear all that. I'm sad. I don't need to hit the gym. That's not my problem. I'm dealing with depression here, but that is part of it. Physical health is mental health. And I can tell you from experience, I'm a slacker. I don't I am not consistent with working out, but when I am going and when I do make that a priority, I feel so much better. And not just physically, but mentally. So it is extremely important to make that connection between mind and body and start working on the whole thing holistically.
That is very well explained. I think we can go on and on about this. This is such a interesting exploration, let's say, and touched on something that I was planning to ask you separately as to what knowledge has evolved as we are doing therapy. Like you broaden the answers to in your response already, and there's something I want to go back to your point earlier, and then it may not be a simple question to explore. It can be a bigger discussion. In that case, we can edit this out from this episode. Okay, so we talked about trauma and we talked about these incomplete sort of or negative experiences in many cases with our parents. Okay, and this is something I have observed myself as well. I had conflicting relationship with my father, and then I lost him all of a sudden, and those questions were never answered. It took me a long time to go back to it and understand, and some of my own interpretation lied in how I understood my father and his situation and his boundary and things like that. And what I felt is that in many cases, when we suffer from, let's say, just to keep it generic and do not affect anyone's emotions there, let's say incomplete relationships, okay, with their parents. And we are often spiteful about that, or we are often hold a grudge or trauma and trauma response in our body for that for a very long time. And I'm talking about healing here. For my case, or my understanding, and something that I discussed with my brother as well, that the key lies to completing each other's story. Like, you have a relation that didn't work, and instead of blaming that, if you see why the said person behaved in some scenarios, and then if you truly understand that rationally, that in a way helps you heal as well. Like, you, when someone, let's say when someone bullies you, or let's say someone abuses you, and then you feel bad and you feel shame, but if you rise to a position where you can understand that person's point of view, where they are coming from, and then you can better protect yourself from whatever is thrown at you. So in a way, these are pieces of bigger puzzle, and they fit together. That's my take. And I wrote something on Mother's Day this year, and everyone who listened to it, they said, I really needed to hear this because I had a difficult relationship with my mother. So my question to you is, I'm sorry, there was a lot of description, is that when we are looking at a path of growth, healing, and resilience, do you think we can complete the stories and find a way forward? Is that a right approach, or that's probably not something one should entertain?
So it can be. I think we all, I think we all just innately have a desire for understanding. We want to understand why. And especially if something happened, and oddly enough, it's usually something bad. We don't usually question when something good happens, like, why did that? But I think it's part of just our consciousness. And this kind of goes into, I know there's a lot of psychological theory and philosophy, and I don't think they're necessarily separate. I think philosophy is the way that we try to explain the world around us, try to explain and understand our experience in life. And psychology definitely plays a big role in that. So we try to sometimes try to understand our parents in terms of, well, why did they do this or do that? Why did they treat me this way or that way? So it's important, and it's usually a big question that weighs on us. Um, I think my only thought on that would be maybe just try not to get hung up on it, because what if you never get those answers? Like you said, if your father passes away, you'll never get those answers. So if you're so convinced that completing that puzzle is the only way for you to heal and grow, you're going to be stuck with it. You're not going to get those answers. Think of someone that was maybe given up for adoption. A mother had a child, and for whatever reason, she gave it for adoption. And that child grows up, and at a certain age, they learn this. Maybe they had the greatest loving family, and that's now their family 1000%. And at some point, they are able to hear that information. Say, oh, by the way, this was your real mother. Here's when this happened, et cetera, et cetera. They may never, ever get an answer for why. Not maybe not a complete answer. And that can be extremely difficult to live with and to try to understand. So maybe the maybe the best way is to say, okay, I'm going to find out as much as I can, but if it's not possible for me to find out all the answers, then I just have to try to understand that this happened, that happened. I will never know why, but I'm not going to let that define my life. It's a part of me. We venture into this this way of thinking that, uh, and I've seen some of this talked about and promoted, is this distancing of, well, I have this condition, I have this disease, I have this whatever, but it's not me. It's this separate thing. That can be useful at times, but it can also be very useful to say, yeah, this is part of my story. This is part of my journey. Now, what I do with it, I get to choose now. And I think that's where the really deep, we're past the surface level stuff in terms of dealing with symptoms, of initial conversations of what happened. Now we're down deep into the really healing part. And that is, I am very honest about the circumstances, the past, the present. Now I get to choose how I want to move forward and how I want to maybe use those events, use those feelings to produce something else in my life. Something, so my mom died when I was 8, and I was then sent to live with my dad, who I had never even seen before. And he was emotionally, psychologically abusive. The way he spoke to me, the way he treated me, the way things were done in the family. I remember when I was about 12 years old, I was having a discussion with one of my best friends. He lived down the street from me, and we had just become friends when I moved there with my dad. So we'd only been friends for about 3 years, but we were having a talk one day, and somehow we came across along the discussion of having children in the future. And I remember distinctly making the comment and saying to him, you know what? If I ever have children, I'm not going to treat them like my dad treats me. So even then, when I I had no clue of what I was actually saying, I had already determined that what I was experiencing and what I had been through up to that point, I was making a conscious decision to do the opposite. At least try. That was my goal. And I think that's where, just like you mentioned with your dad and maybe some of these other relationships that we experience, that just sometimes they're just not fair. Sometimes they're not what they should be, whether that's mild or severe. When it comes to the point of healing, that's where we have that opportunity to say, yes, this did happen. Yes, this is how it affected me. Yes, here's what I know about it, or I don't really know that much about it, but here's the choice I'm going to make moving forward. And that, when you're at that stage and at that level, that is where the healing and the growth are really taking effect. That's where you're starting to see flowers bloom. That's where you're starting to see fruit grow on a plant, on seeds that you planted 2, 3, 10 years ago at the beginning of your process, the beginning of your journey. Now you're starting to get the fruit from your endeavors.
That is really deep and philosophical. I know we started talking about trauma in our first episode, and we have gone through a lot of explorations, but I think this is a very touching finale or closing thought that we can apply to this discussion. I think that the ADHD side of things that we initially talked about covering, maybe that needs a separate discussion because that's a very different topic from this one. And no, but thank you for joining me for the second episode, Jamie. It was really deep and beautiful to hear from you. And I would like to tell to our audience to go check your books again. And yeah, if they have any questions, they can reach out over the social handles that we will provide in the episode description.
Absolutely. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I appreciate not just you having me as a guest, but I appreciate what you're doing and just having these educational discussions, but at the same time, some frank and heartfelt discussions. And we all need that at times. And so I hope people can take a nugget of knowledge, a nugget of wisdom, a nugget of encouragement, and just keep moving forward in their journey and their healing.